In this video, we will discuss the context of the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is a text that we will usually find in our Hebrew Bibles or Old Testaments, between the texts of Judges and 1 Samuel. It's usually placed here because it is set in the time of the Judges, according to the first verse of the text. However, most scholars believe that this text was actually written in the Second Temple period, between about 516 and 70 CE. The reasons for this have to do with concerns of the text, as well as the language used, which would be more appropriate to the Second Temple period rather than the more archaic version of Hebrew we see about 500 to 1,000 years earlier. Now, the text was not written by Ruth. The title is put on about the main character in the story. We don't actually know who wrote this text, but the person definitely seems concerned with the idea of marriage, and marriage particularly to foreigners. Marrying foreigners was a major concern in the Second Temple community. Some people thought that marrying foreign women, particularly, would in some way illegitimate their Jewish bloodline. This was a pretty big point of contention, which we'll see later with Ezra and Nehemiah as well. So our story with Ruth, who is a Moabite woman, who is not a Jew, presents a story where we see a positive interaction between an Israelite and a foreign woman who end up being married. Now, it's important to know that this text is historical fiction, and this is not necessarily a term that we put on in the 21st century. Most Israelites would have seen this text as a historical fiction text. This is not to say that Ruth did or did not exist. We don't really know what they thought about that at this point. But the tale, the way it is set up, is very clearly a short story that is created as some kind of historical fiction, and a tale that's set in a particular period. We're going to go through the text chapter by chapter, since there's only 4 chapters, and talk about some of the details that we see in each of these. The first chapter starts with a tale set in the time when the judges ruled the land, according to the first verse. And we have a man from Bethlehem who is an Israelite. His name is Elimelech, which literally means God is my king. And he's married to a woman named Naomi. They have 2 children, both sons, and the sons marry foreign women in Moab. So we have both Ruth and Orpah, who are Moabites. Now, it's important to look back at the Hebrew Bible and find where the Moabites came from. Based on the text that we see in Genesis 19:37, Israelites believe that the Moabites were the descendants of Lot and one of Lot's daughters. We have the scene in Genesis 19 after the destruction of Sodom, where Lot's daughters impregnate themselves, essentially, with their father's children, and have sons named Ammon and Moab. So Moabites, according to this tradition, did not have a very good beginning. So when we see Ruth act as a positive figure, then this is in some way a redemption of the Moabites' character. We see Orpah in this text, and Orpah is also a Moabite and would be a sister-in-law to Ruth. And many people portray Orpah as an evil character because she goes back to her homeland. But instead of following a foreign person to her, she simply goes back to what she had known and to her family before. Ruth stays with Naomi, and one of the key issues here that we need to remember is the idea of security in the ancient Israelite tradition. Ruth clinging to Naomi would not necessarily be a way for her to be secure. For women at this time period, security particularly came in the form of a man who is related. So this would either be a husband that somebody had taken, a son, a father, perhaps an uncle or brother. But a woman who did not have these things did not have any kind of security or safety. So Ruth, whose husband had died, who did not have a father who was an Israelite, so she had left her homeland, essentially had no sense of security since she did not have a son either. So we ask ourselves why Ruth clings to Naomi at the end of this text. The idea here is some kind of loyalty or love. In Hebrew, the word that we see is chesed. And this does not mean love as in the sense of romantic or even friendship love, but some kind of loyalty or kindness, some kind of clinging to somebody because you are loyal to them. And this is what we see between Ruth and Naomi. As we move into chapter 2, we see Ruth taking part in the harvest of barley and later of wheat. Ruth goes out without discussing with people besides Naomi and starts harvesting barley from the field to feed her and her mother-in-law. Now this action was rather bold of Ruth at this point. As we see later when Boaz talks to Ruth, he tells her that he will prevent the other young men from bothering her. Ruth going out into the fields alone, as a foreign woman especially, would have been a very unsafe act. She could have gotten killed because she was foreign. She could have gotten abused or raped. And all of these things would not be seen as a problem necessarily, simply because she was not actually an Israelite. As we move into chapter 3, Boaz offers her some protection. It says that people will not bother her. And Ruth decides to take matters into her own hands for her own safety and security. And part of this is through her discussion with Naomi. Naomi says in chapter 3, verse 1, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you, so that it may be well with you." So she tells Ruth to go to the threshing floor and see her kinsman, Boaz. Now, threshing floor was a place where after the wheat or barley had been gleaned, it was mostly a level, flat area. And people would sleep here, usually after some revelries, drinking wine, etc., and might sleep here, which is what Boaz does. We have an interesting scene as Ruth comes to Boaz in the middle of the night when nobody else is looking. And this is a pretty big emphasis of the text, that no one is paying attention, so that Ruth can kind of sneak in and sneak out. Ruth goes in, and it says that she, in verse 7, she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. Now we see Boaz here. He's full, he's drunk, and he's tired. So he's lying down in a heap of grain. And in the Hebrew, we see this word feet used in many other places to refer to male genitals. So whatever Ruth is doing here is not really clear. There are scholars on one side who say that this is not in view here, that Ruth is simply uncovering his feet or using his cloak, while other scholars say this is some kind of form of seduction. Whatever happens, the importance of the story is that Boaz offers her some kind of redemption, acting as her next of kin. The idea of the next of kin is really important to the Israelite tradition at this point. As the next of kin, a man would be responsible for essentially redeeming a woman by providing her with children or some kind of security. For example, if a woman was married to a man and that man died, then his brother or next closest kin would be responsible for marrying this woman. And when they got married, any of the children that they produced by this levirate law would biologically be her new husbands, but would technically and genealogically be her previous husbands. So for example, we see Ruth married here to Boaz, and any children that Boaz and Ruth would produce would not actually carry the name of Boaz, but of Ruth's previous husband, according to levirate law. The reason that Ruth's technical next of kin, who Boaz asks permission from to marry Ruth, would not want to marry Ruth is because all of his children who he would produce with Ruth, as well as the land that they would inherit, would not actually carry his name. This was the levirate law, which was common in ancient Israel, but obviously you can see how it was not necessarily something that would be favored by a lot of people. So the genealogy that we see in the text as we finish looking at the text of Ruth talks about Ruth being the ancestor of David. And David becomes perhaps one of the greatest kings of the Israelite tradition. So Ruth plays an important role, again, whether a historical or a fictional character. Ruth plays an important role as ancestor to David, and it's quite notable that she is a Gentile woman, not actually an Israelite. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, authorial intent, and context of the Book of Ruth, describe the progression of the narrative, and explain key terms and ideas used in the text.